Hello, Humane marketers. Sarah Znakrocha here. Welcome to another episode of the Humane Marketing Podcast, a place to be for the generation of marketers who cares. This is the show where we talk about marketing your business in a way that feels good to you, is aligned with your values, and also resonates more with your conscious customers because it's not pushy, ethical, and also beautiful. So if you're a regular here, you know that I'm organizing the conversations around the 7 Ps of humane marketing. And if you're new here and this is your first time, welcome. I'm so excited you're here. You may want to download your one-page marketing plan with the 7 Ps of humane marketing in the form of a mandala at humane.marketing/one page, the number one and page. So again, humane.marketing/one page. And with that, with no further ado, let's dive into today's conversation. Hi, Jurgen. I'm so glad that we get another chance to talk to each other. I was on your podcast recently, and now I have you here. I'm so delighted to have you on the Humane Marketing Podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm glad that we're talking again, Sarah.
Wonderful. So our topic for today is podcasting, as well as kind of a smaller topic after networking circles. But let's start with podcasting because that's really kind of become a big area of expertise for you. You're celebrating soon, as of this recording, or probably when it goes live, you have already celebrated 500 episodes of your own podcast. So, wow,
right.
Congratulations. 500 episodes. That's quite the milestone. When did you start? And tell us a little bit about this journey of recording 500 episodes.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I wrap up my show with a guest and I let them know when we're going to publish and which episode number, and now each time I say, it's episode 490 something, I think we're recording at the moment, and I always have to hesitate there and think, wow, we've come a long way. So we started back in August of 2014. So we've been going for over 7 years.
Wow.
And it started off, a mentor of mine suggested start a podcast as a marketing and positioning exercise. And I'd always been a fan of audio books, and even way back when they were still on cassette tapes and CDs. And I used to travel a lot, and I used to have to commute a lot when I was in my corporate roles. And I would listen in all those travel times or waiting at airports and so on. I would listen to audio books, and I found that a really great way to absorb a lot of material, much easier and less tiring for me personally than reading the physical book. And when podcasts started, I really just dove into the medium, but I always imagined it as something that was, a professional radio studio. You needed all this expensive setup to do a podcast. And this mentor of mine, he was actually running his own podcast, and he had actually, because his background was in video production, so he did have a proper studio. But he said, no, come and have a look what I've set up. I'll show you what you actually need as a minimum. And when he showed me that, I thought, I can do all that. And I'm a techno geek from way back, so I was sort of excited to get into that. And I used to do home recordings of my kids playing music onto tape recorders and so on. So I thought, this is really just a digital version of that. So I got started and immediately reached out to all the people that in my corporate career all around the world I had these really good relationships with, but in my small business no longer had a professional reason to connect with them. With the podcast, I had this ready-made list of guests immediately, and that's how it kicked off. And then it just became this flywheel that was almost impossible to stop when people introduced me to others that I should talk to on the podcast. And over time it evolved into this medium where I had a 1 hour masterclass, sometimes 1 hour, sometimes 45 minutes. Recently this week we had 2 episodes where we got quite carried away and went for an hour and a half, but a masterclass from an expert in their field that I get the privilege to learn from. And then, of course, I get to share that with my audience. So it's kind of a win for everybody.
Right.
So that's been the journey. And as I say, before I knew it, I was at episode 400 and whatever, 490 something we're recording now. And soon we'll have episode 500 and going forward. And I'm still enjoying it. You know, we've been consistent over that time. Started off with 1 episode per week, went to 2 episodes per week. We did a little while, we did 3 episodes per week because we had so many recordings backed up that guests were waiting 6 months to have their episode published, and I thought that was a bit too long to let them wait. So we caught up a little bit and balanced bringing people on to the recording session and publishing the episodes. And yeah, here we are nearly at episode 500.
That's amazing. Yeah, just wow, what a journey. There's so much in what you just shared that I want to dig deeper into. And you started with, kind of the overwhelm of, not knowing how this is going to work out and what kind of tools do you need. I think that's often what we hear for someone who is podcasting for the first time. So we'll get into the tools and the tech and all of that we need. What I want to start with is what you then shared a little bit, but I want to go deeper into that. Like, what has this podcast done for you? I would say on a business level and on a personal level. I can tell that you're clearly passionate about it. So it's probably part heart project, but at the same time, you wouldn't be doing it if it was just for your own pleasure. So tell us a little bit more about what this podcast has done for you.
Yeah. Well, I realized probably after about the first 30 or so episodes that this was an amazing networking tool for me to connect me with people all around the world. And as I say, experts in their field that were giving me their time, their insights into their area of expertise. As a result, I was able to learn a lot of things that I could bring into my business or connect with people that were experts that could help me do something in their business. So often I would, if I needed a particular service that a guest of mine had and I developed a good relationship with them, I would turn to that guest for that particular service. And also some of my guests have become clients because we've built that relationship and they've said, hey, we need your help in doing something that you're good at. So that was kind of a very immediate benefit. But for the longer term now, and I know you want to talk about the networking events and things that I've also started doing, these guests on my podcast have kind of become a community, and I know I can reach out to most of them and get a very quick response to an answer to a question. If I ask questions, and I'll get a very quick answer, insights or feedback on something. And also, we've recently a few of the guests, we've done some work together in terms of a joint venture type opportunity. So there's lots of different areas where it's benefited second degree, I like to say. So we've started off as podcast host and podcast guest. That's built a relationship, and we've taken that relationship further in the sense of, hey, there's an opportunity to either work together directly as a client and provider relationship, or there's an opportunity to work together on a joint project, or it's just a case of if I need some advice, or also guests needing advice, reaching out to me, or I reaching out to them and asking for advice. So there's all of those things have opened up for me. And then over the years, of course, we've really fine-tuned our entire system to produce the podcast from, identifying guests to making them feel comfortable when they come on the show, to all the production after the recording, to the promotion of the show. And all of that, people have seen us do that and said, hey, how do you do all that? So we've got all these services now and helping other people with their podcasts in various forms.
Okay, wow. What strikes me as very different from your approach is that, usually when you hear people talking about podcasting, it's all about growing your podcast and getting more and more listeners and getting more and more reach. Not once have I heard you say the word listeners. So it's like almost like you're focusing, I won't say more because you can chime in after, but you're focusing a lot of attention on the guests, which probably most people don't do so much. At least I haven't seen it. Like I have not felt like, oh, I'm now part of a community whenever I've been guesting on a podcast. Not at all. I can't think. Maybe a few examples where we stay in touch, but it hasn't felt like, oh, you really matter. No, you're just like, one of my guests and now move on to the next one. So I find that a really very different strategy and a very humane strategies, that it's not, just like a factory. Okay, next guest, next guest, next guest. So that's interesting. But do tell us also kind of about, your listeners, what has developed out of the people listening to your podcast.
Yeah. Well, the listeners first and foremost, why we do the podcast. So,
right.
and we're very clear right from the get-go on who are our dream audience. And when we work with other people to launch podcasts, that's really where we start. We actually start with themselves, with the podcast host and their business and why they're doing it and what they hope to get out of it. And then the listeners. For me, then the next level, of course, is the guests, because I say that I want everybody to have an awesome experience. I know if I do the right preparation and come with the right mindset, that I will have an awesome experience speaking to somebody like you on your area of expertise. I want my guests to also have an awesome experience. And if we together have an awesome experience, then it becomes an awesome experience for my listener. I'm also very protective of my listeners in that I don't take everyone who, like we get lots of pitches now for guests. In the early days, of course, I was very active in bringing guests on board. I still actively bring guests on board. However, the balance now is probably 50-50. So 50% of the guests I've been introduced to and I invite them to the show. The other 50% pitch me and ask to be on the show. And for those that send me a request to come on the show, I very carefully filter them. Are they a match for my audience? Are they a match for the kind of topic areas we cover? So I'm very protective.
Sorry to interrupt. It's probably the same amount of work to kind of filter them as to invite your own guests, I often find, because the pitches, quite frankly, there's exceptions, but a lot of the pitches are just kind of like random. And so you have to actually do the work and figure out, are they a good fit?
Well, yours certainly stood out. Yours was an exceptional one.
Oh, thank you.
Immediately got my attention and
I wasn't
and I
fishing for compliments.
Well, no, that's because that's the style. I pitch to go on podcasts as well. And that's the style of pitch that I do. It's a personal reach out and I get on video. I show them what they can expect. I actually have a standard response for people who pitch me and it's a templated response. So I'm very anti-template, but this is a templated response, but my templates are very special, I think. And it allows me, so if I get a pitch, I immediately, it's like hitting the tennis ball back into the other side of the court over the net. And so the other person then has to do some more work to convince me that they're a good fit. So the templated response is, thanks for your interest in coming on to our show. And we're being much more selective now because we really want to protect our our audience and make sure that the guest is a really good fit for the subjects we cover and for the audience. So I say that up front. I then say, can you please, the first step is please schedule a short call with me, and I give them a calendar link. The second step is complete this intake form. So I have an intake form where they give me a lot of background information, and some of those questions are, why are you a good fit? And have you listened to an episode? And can you give me some feedback on an episode? Because it's kind of, that evolved over time. I didn't used to ask that, but I've learned that not everybody listens to the show before they actually come on the show, which I thought was a given. Mm-hmm. So I kind of put them through that filter. And then I also send them some videos that I recorded a little while ago about what excites me, podcast pitch. So I talk about, if somebody sends me a personalized video, that gets me excited. I'm immediately attracted to that person, and I immediately will then look at their background and probably reach back out to them to have a conversation. So I turn it around very quickly like that to all the pitches I get. And then the next step, of course, is then if I have all the information back from the person and we have that short call, then I can determine very quickly if they're a fit for my audience, if they're a fit for the show and the topics we cover. And also the short call has the benefit of we get to know one another. So when we then do get on the show itself, we've already had a conversation. We already know one another. We've already started a bit of a relationship.
Yeah, exactly. That was a few people do it, but not everybody has that kind of first 15-minute call. So that definitely helps you filter, probably, even though I can imagine for me as an introvert, it would be hard to say, actually we're not a good fit. So I'm curious, how do you do that?
That was a bit of a challenge at first. If it's really obvious from the pitch, and if the person, like some of the pitches, and I'm sure you've seen these, when people pitch to you, they say, hey, I'm Jurgen and I've done this and I do that and I'm an expert in these things. So it's all about me instead of the value that I might be able to bring to your audience or to your podcast. So if I get a pitch like that, I'm already very wary. And if the topic itself it's not really clear to me it's a good fit, I usually just send back a polite decline.
Right. That's easy via email. But what I'm talking about is when you talk to them. And you're
I have been, and I made a mistake recently on something, and I say who this was because the podcast has been published, and I think we actually made a pretty good show out of it, but it turns out it wasn't all that good a fit. I didn't think it was a good fit to start with, but I saw some things that perhaps we could explore. So the person came on the short call and I actually said right at the beginning, I'm not sure your topic is a good fit for my audience and my show.
Right.
But they'd pitched me and so I said, but maybe we can explore some areas. So then we came up with some areas to explore, and they were around sales and they were around lessons that we could take from this business, which was way different to anything else I've had, but the lessons we could take from that into our area. And I wasn't strict enough to keep the person on track for the lessons, and they took the opportunity to talk a lot more about their business than I really wanted, because the business that they were doing was not really relevant to my audience as such.
It's
that
not an easy task.
That one got through, but I have said to people, and I just say, look, this is nothing personal. You're just not a fit. I'm very clear on who my audience is. I'm very clear on the type of content that I want to put in front of them, I want to talk about, and that's just me. That's just what I've chosen to do, and I don't think this is going to work. If it's a good conversation, and I've connected with so many people that have podcasts, if I think of somebody who might be a good fit, I'll mention some podcasts to them, or I'll certainly point them to Podmatch and to Matchmaker, the podcast services. And I'd say to them, hey, if you're looking to get on other shows, this might be a suggestion if I can think of one that's a good fit. And if you'd like an introduction, I'm happy to make that. Or alternatively, go and look at these websites, because that's where podcasters looking for guests actually hang out, and you can pitch them there.
Let's talk a little bit about those tools and the tech and the systems, all of that stuff, because with 2 or sometimes even 3 episodes per week, I'm sure you by now, and you did say, it wasn't always like that, but by now you have like the whole system, probably not completely automatized, but a lot of it is just kind of in the flow, right? So you really just get to do what you love doing, which is the interviews. So tell us a little bit about, the tools you use and the tech. I think you have a team as well. So tell us a bit about
That's right.
system.
Yeah. I've got a team that edit the show, that do all the promotional material, produce all the promotional material, that do the invitations up front from the guests. So I usually connect with people that might be possible guests, and then if somebody pitches me, it usually comes into my email, so I'll respond to those. But I will also copy in my team member, my assistant, who does the scheduling, and she will then sort the people. She'll do some background research for me and invite the people and do all the scheduling. With the scheduling, we've got a calendar system set up that once they're booked in, I think it's the same one you use, once they're booked in, that will put the appointment in my calendar together with the link to the platform that we record on. It will put that into the guest's calendar. It's set up to send out reminders a week before, a day before, and then an hour before.
Just want to chime in and say what I'm using is Acuity Scheduling, and I think that's what you're using. And there's also Calendly that people
That's right.
look up.
There's quite a few of those around. So that's really important, because it helps a lot in terms. So my assistant actually suggests 3 times. So we don't let them book directly a time, because that got very out of hand. We did do that for a little while, but that got very out of hand, because I found that often I'd do 5 recordings in a day, and that's just too much. I can do 3, but at the end of 3, I'm exhausted. It's, as an introvert, that takes a lot of energy. So the booking. So for the get to know you calls, that I allow the guest to book. So I've got in Acuity, I've got times set up where I'll do those. Usually it's 1 or 2 days and specific time window that covers international time zones as well. So that's a bit of a challenge as well, because of the time differences. But that's set up so that I just send out that link and the guest can book at their convenience, and that just links to my calendar, so they can only see times when I'm free within those windows that I've set. So that's the calendar part. We use Squadcast to record the conversations. The Squadcast allows you to record locally at each site, and that produces the highest quality audio if you do that. And it also records and uploads dynamically, so that if we get cut off because of an internet issue, for example, then the conversation up to that stage is recorded and it's uploaded. So that just means we have to edit together the various bits if we reconnect then. I've got various follow-up systems. So when I complete a recording, I will send an email. I'll personally send an email, thank you. And the way I do that now, I have a template which basically outlines all the steps that happen from there. And in that template, I add a recorded message that's personalized, and I add the times when we're going to publish that episode. I will also send out some social media posts immediately after the episode saying, hey, we just had a fantastic conversation with Sarah and we talked about these things. Look out for the episode to publish in December or whenever. Then after that, my team then takes over. They they edit the audio, they produce show notes, they produce social media posts. From that, they upload the completed or the edited thing, or actually they prompt me to do an intro and outro recording. Mm-hmm. Then they edit it all together, upload that to the hosting platform, and we use Captivate FM. And then they schedule all the social media postings, and they actually send an email on my behalf that tells the guest and also the people who introduced me to that guest that their episode is published. I follow up with a personalized video message, usually about a week after the recording, just to kind of keep the relationship going. And then once the episode's published, I make sure that I'm on particularly LinkedIn and commenting on the posts and commenting on other people interacting on those posts. So engaging in that conversation.
Wow, that's really quite the production.
And there's probably amazing. A few bits and pieces that are there that I...
How long would you say, how much time do you personally spend on each episode?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually looked at that recently because one of the joint venture initiatives that I mentioned earlier, we were talking about sharing how you can get the time to produce a podcast down to about 2 to 4 hours per episode. I think that's about what I personally spend. So I do listen to other podcasts that my guest has been on, and I typically do that while I'm doing something else. So it might be while I'm commuting, it might be while I'm out walking. So I don't necessarily count that time as work I do for that podcast. Then I spend a little bit of time looking at all the material that my team's put together, background research, and thinking about some of the topics that I want to cover. And that typically I'll spend about an hour doing that before the episode. And I've learnt over time that I don't need... In the early days, I would probably spend about 4 hours, and I would script out the episode very carefully. So I'd have his question 1. Okay, what might Sarah say to question 1? Well, she might say this, she might say that. Well, okay, if she says this, I'll go here. That'll be question 2. If she says this, that'll be question 2. And I have this very complex script. And of course, most guests didn't say that or that. They said something completely
You're like,
different.
Oh no, where am I?
And it threw me right off. And then I'd come back in, well, I've got to try and get this question in. And some of those episodes were really stilted because it was kind of like I was trying to get back on this track that I'd laid out. And what I've learnt over the years, and I discovered this, even some of my very early episodes, that I had a relationship with the person because I knew them from my corporate days. And I thought, wow, they're really good episodes because it was just a natural conversation between people that knew one another. And I thought that's what I've got to get to, even with people that I don't know that well. Yeah. And so now I just take the approach of, okay, let's go 5 to 7 bullet points of things that I touch on. And I was explaining this to a guest this week that we did the recording. I had actually 8 bullet points for her, and we didn't touch on one of them. And we had an hour and a half conversation. So it's really about, when I get onto that, as long as I've read up on the person, I've got some idea about their background, I've got some idea about their expertise, I then trust myself to have a conversation that's interesting. And I'll start off with some things, and depending on, I just have to listen really carefully. And depending on what they say, I will respond to what they say, and we could go off in any direction. For me, it's just like if I meet somebody and at some event, whatever it might be, I meet somebody, there's no preparation goes into that. It might be a per chance meeting. But if we build a bit of a bond and we find some common interest, that could certainly turn into an hour conversation without any preparation. So that's kind of how I approach it now. As I say, I probably do about an hour preparation, not counting the time I listen to podcasts, which usually is done while I'm doing something else. And then after the show, there might be another hour of things I do to wrap up. And then after that, there's 5 minutes here and there to send the video thank you later on. And we have, of course, reminder systems set up that remind me, now it might be time to touch base with Sarah again, or it's 3 months since you've connected or touched base with this particular guest. So then I just spend 5 minutes to maybe have a look at their LinkedIn posts again to see what's happening in their world.
I love that follow-up as well. I think that really feels like that's a big focus for you, the human relationship, and I love that piece. So it's kind of like, yes, we use systems, but we use the systems in order to really deepen the human relationships.
Exactly.
Love that.
That's my whole philosophy around marketing, is exactly that the systems are there to take care of the mundane and free up people's time so that we can build those relationships or continue those relationships.
The other thing I would just also highlight is that, maybe for some listeners they're like, oh my God, this is 2 to 4 hours of time investment for each episode. Plus you have a team. So, how much time would that mean for just a single episode? So that's definitely something to think about. And yes, a podcast is a lot of work. And the other thing that you really show is it needs consistency. How many podcasts do we see that start and have 20 episodes and then they disappear, which could be a thing that you do for like a special event. I have a friend of mine who does a podcast right now because he's launching a book. And so from the get-go, it's like, well, I do this about the book and it's part of that book launch. So that's fine. But if you're starting a podcast and then, just kind of it wanes out after 15 episodes, then that's probably not the goal.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. It comes back to what the purpose of the podcast is. And the book launch is a great example, because I think a podcast is a really great way to enhance a book launch and to help grow book sales, particularly at the beginning. And one of the beauties of that is that in terms of content, the book author already has the content, right? They've written the book. So you can reuse that content. So all the research that I do is about understanding the guests that I'm bringing on, understanding their business, what drives them, and getting to know them a little bit. So if you're doing a solo podcast, it's about preparing the content that you're going to present. And if you've written a book, you've got the content, you've done that work. So really the podcast itself is the preparation part is already done in writing the book. So it's really more about, okay, how do I repurpose that? And then, of course, afterwards, there's quite a bit of work in production and promotion of the podcast. The good news for that is, as you said, there's a lot of podcasts out there that kind of fade out after, I think 7 to 12 or 13 episodes is the pod fade period, where people get frustrated because they're not getting immediate results from it, and also they're starting to realize, hey, this is actually quite a bit of work.
This is work.
But the good news is, if podcasting is for you and you really want to do it and you're consistent and you stay at it, you can build systems around it to make it a lot easier over time, and you will stand out, because I think there's about 2 million active podcasts around now at the moment, whereas there's 600 billion or more blogs out there, and yet people put a lot of effort into writing blogs thinking that a blog is going to make them stand out in the world, whereas it's
It's
much
also
easier with a
different to
podcast.
hear you than to just read you all the time, right? So that relationship really develops in a different way. Two things I want to say, and then I want to talk about those networking circles. But the first thing is, I think here we're a lot about giving ourselves permission as well to do it our way. So just because people listen to you who have, in 7 years, have developed these systems and are now really proficient at it, there's no reason to start out small and say, well, let me start with one episode every 2 weeks. I think what's more important is the consistency than the actual quantity. So I want to give our listeners permission to say, I just want to start building these relationships, and maybe the purpose is not so much to get thousands of listeners, but to have a reason to get people to come to you and talk about a topic. So that's
right, absolutely. And it's the most important thing is who is the audience you want to get in front of, who's the audience that you have a message for, that you can make a difference in their world. And if you get in front of that audience and then have that consistency that you mentioned, Sarah, and make the expectation clear up front. So you could, start off a podcast and say, this is going to be monthly. We're going to publish on this particular day of every month, and here's what each episode will contain. So look out for it and tell people how they can follow the podcast or subscribe to it. Exactly. And then you just organically grow your audience from there. You encourage people to leave reviews. You encourage people to share it with other like-minded people that it could help. And consistency and adding value is the key.
Yeah. Yeah. And also letting go maybe of this idea to have the perfect show at the very beginning. So I had to smile when you said how you prepared your questions, because that's another thing that comes with experience, to not make it sound like an interview. So, kind of getting just into this flow. Like now I only have a couple of bullet points that I know that I want to address. And then every now and then my eyes go down because I have to look, where are we heading now? But other than that, it really is just kind of this flow, but it wasn't always like that. I had structure.
We've made a real conscious decision to avoid the use of the word interview. I say, in fact, all the documentation, I think I've gotten rid of all of it, although, there were a few places where it kind of still was there, but I think we've gotten rid of it in all of our documentation, all of the emails that we send out in our sequences to remind people when they come on, all of the platforms that we use where, the reminders go out through Acuity and that. Everything has been changed to our conversation will be recorded. Yeah. So I talk about it as a conversation. And to me, changing my mindset around this is just a conversation. Right. And yes, of course, I'm going to ask questions. And yes, of course, I'm going to follow up questions with, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Or that's interesting. Why do you say that? Those kind of things. But it's not a scripted process. It's a conversation.
I think actually one of the things that I noticed when I listen to podcasts that are probably in the beginning stages is when they say, next question, because actually that's not how you talk in a conversation. You don't say, I'm going to ask you the next question. Yeah. So maybe that's something to kind of also take out of your vocabulary. You don't need to say, let me ask. Well, you can say, let me ask you this or something like that, but it doesn't have to be announced as the next question.
That's right. Well, there's a real funny one, and I've had this quite a few times where people say, can I ask you a question? And my normal response is, well, you just did.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, let's use these last 5 minutes to talk about the networking circle. So that's where you take the relationship even to a further level with your guests. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, my friend Karan Nijawan runs these networking dinners. And so he gets together a group of like-minded people, a small group in a dinner setting, and facilitates conversations that go deeper than the traditional networking event where you meet somebody and say, "Oh, hello, I'm Jurgen. What do you do?" And they say, "What do you do?" And you exchange business cards, and then you get home and you throw out all the business cards into the rubbish bin because none of those people are the businesses that they're in. That's not what you're looking for right then and there. So it's kind of a bit of a waste of time. His facilitated meetings were actually much deeper conversations about sort of meaningful things. So I took this when we were in the early stages of the pandemic and there were lockdowns and everybody was getting on Zoom, and I thought, how can we make these Zoom meetings more interesting? And it coincided with the time when we had episode 250, I think it might have been, where I decided, why don't I just bring people together on Zoom, bring former guests together on Zoom to celebrate 250 episodes, and I'll kind of run this event like those networking dinners that Karan runs. And so I did that, and I used the Zoom breakout rooms. So I kind of set the stage, told people we're going to have some deep, meaningful conversations, and it was a safe space. And if you're not comfortable going deep and be prepared to be vulnerable, then now's a good time to leave. And everybody got really excited and said, no, we're here, we're on board. So I start off with breakout rooms of 2 people, and I ask a simple question like, what's got you excited right now?
Right.
And people have 2 minutes to say that. Now, depending on how much detail they want to go into, they'll share something. And then when they come back into the main room, I then ask for volunteers to share what they learnt about others. And it kind of creates a real dynamic atmosphere, and everybody feels part of this big, feels this connection. And then I send them off to a second breakout of 1-to-1. And I usually ask a deeper question there of something like what's a limiting belief that you've overcome and how did you overcome it is one that I've used. And so that requires people to get a little bit vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then usually we do 3 more rounds, and I put people in groups of 3 or 4 at that point and ask some more questions like that, and then bring people back into the room. And I have music going when they come back into the room, and I'm usually there dancing to the music. So it's kind of a fun party atmosphere. And I thought I did that because at the trigger point was this celebration of a milestone podcast event. And then everybody had so much fun. And I encourage people then afterwards to say, okay, you've learned something about other people. Connect with one another outside this event and continue the conversations. And out of that, people have gone on podcasts. So podcast hosts have met potential guests, and so those people have come on as a guest in their podcast. They didn't know one another beforehand. I know that there were some people that actually went on and did business with one another out of that very first event. So it kind of starts off with having meaningful conversations between people that trigger some relationships. And of course, not every conversation led to an ongoing relationship, but those where people felt, hey, there's a connection here, they went on to build that relationship. And I know some of the people that were on that early event are now running those events themselves as well. And I've been a participant in those events too, so it's a lot of fun being a participant as well. But it's kind of an interesting way to use some of the technology that's available in Zoom to help people just break through that, what do you do, and give us your business card, to actually get to know one another at a human level.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I was just on a conference recently, last week, where we had that kind of setup, and the idea was to meet each other in small breakout rooms and not use our job titles to tell the other person who we are. And it was a really difficult concept for people to understand. And so I just put in the chat, networking like we're human. Because that's really the idea. It's like, well, what if you didn't have a job? What if you didn't have a job title? Who are you as a human being? And so a lot of that we also do in the Humane Marketing Circle. It's just like, we show up as human beings, but it's true that we have kind of been brainwashed to these networking events. And so we always feel like we have to put on a show. And so I love what you're doing also with this concept of bringing the guests together. I think that is just so smart. And I think it helps you kind of slow down the process, really just changing the focus on the relationships and not just, like I said before, this factory of guests and one after the other. So beautiful. And I just received your email about the 500th networking invitation. So I can't wait to
well, I'm not sure that's going to be a
it.
networking one. I haven't actually worked out exactly what we're going to do there, but the idea for that is that I have a conversation with a group of people on episode 500, and I've decided it's probably going to be 3 or 4 parts, so 3 or 4 episode 500s because of the number of people that I probably want to bring on. And I will need to plan how to run this with perhaps 8 to 10 people together
like a
on
panel.
a podcast. Like a panel. And when I said I don't do standard questions, I do actually have 5 questions that I ask every guest at the end of our conversation, or sort of as we wrap up the conversation. There's what I call the buzz, which is an innovation round, and there's 5 questions that I ask every guest. And I'm thinking of maybe taking a couple of those questions and going deeper with each guest in kind of a panel discussion.
Wonderful. Can't wait. Well, we're getting to that part of the show here too. And I always ask myself, kind of my guests, a personal question. But before that, I would love for you to tell people where they can find you and find out more about your work and your podcast and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, well, if you go to my website, innovabiz.com.au, so INNOVABIZ, or Z for the American-speaking people, you'll find the podcast there, as well as the other information about our business. And on the pages, you'll see a little, where normally is a chatbot, but it's actually me on video with a welcome message, and you can respond to me with your own video or an audio message or just a normal text message. So the idea of that is it's not a chatbot robot, it's me inviting a conversation. So I'd love you to let me know that you heard me on Sarah's podcast and what you liked about it, and also any feedback you have.
Wonderful. Yeah, I like that invitation. Well, this has been delightful. Thank you so much for taking the time. My last question, and this time it is a question, is what are you grateful for today, Jurgen, or this week?
Well, there's lots of things that I'm grateful for. I mean, I'm healthy. We are coming out of the extended lockdowns here in Australia from COVID. So recently I was able to visit my 93-year-old father and celebrate his birthday, his 93rd birthday. And I hadn't seen him in person for 6 months. I was also able to visit my daughter in Melbourne. So, we'd had lockdowns previously. We couldn't go that far. So I was able to visit her and go out bike riding with her, which we love to do together. So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for my wonderful wife here. And of course, we were together all through the lockdown. So that was good. And and just all these wonderful guests that I have on my podcast, and all these connections and opportunities to come on other people's podcasts like this one.
Thank you so much. I love talking to you, and we'll do it again, even without a podcast interview.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jürgen. Take care.
Well, thanks, Sarah.
Thanks so much for watching and being part of a generation of marketers who cares for yourself, for your clients, and for the planet. We really are change makers before we are marketers. So go ahead, be the change you want to see in the world. And I hope to see you again next week. Take care.